Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay, good morning, everyone. Okay, we continue now in the chapter on the way to a fortunate rebirth. This is in chapter 5. Okay, over the last two sessions, we explored the Buddha's teaching of karma and its corollary of rebirth. And we see that early Buddhism has basically an ethical conception. Excuse me. An ethical conception of the law of karma, according to which the main factor that determines our mode of rebirth and many of our experiences in the course of our lives are the good and bad deeds that we have done, especially in previous lives. Good and bad is the common expression, but the technical expression that the Buddhist texts use is kusala and akusala, which means wholesome and unwholesome. And so it's our unwholesome deeds that tend to lead to an unhappy state of rebirth, particularly when they're strong unwholesome deeds, to rebirth in the lower realms. And these deeds produce pain and suffering and difficult circumstances in the course of a life. Whereas the wholesome deeds tend to lead to a happy or fortunate rebirth and to good fortune and happiness within the course of our lives. Now, in Buddhism, I explained briefly last week that the concept of wholesome deed, the concept of kusala, what is wholesome, has three connotations. One is what is psychologically healthy, mentally wholesome. Second, what is ethically praiseworthy, from the moral point of view, what is ethically praiseworthy. And then karmically, from the karmic point of view, the wholesome is what leads to favorable results, to happiness and well-being in future lives, also in this life and in future lives. Now, this potential of wholesome deeds to produce well-being and happiness in future lives is what is called in the Buddhist text merit, the meritorious nature of wholesome deeds. The Pali term for this is punya. Okay, so in Pali it's punya, in Sanskrit it's pronounced the same way, but the spelling is a little bit different. And so punya, or merit, we can explain as wholesome karma in its capacity to produce favorable results within the cycle of rebirth. That is, this is wholesome karma insofar as it conduces to fortunate states of rebirth and to good circumstances, good conditions within any state of existence. And there are two kinds of fruits or results of deeds of merit. One are mundane good results. Technically these are called lokiya. That which relates to the world, pertains to the world. And this would include a good rebirth, wealth, good health, long life, beautiful features, success in education and employment, physical security, and so on. And then the other type of results to which merit leads are the supramundane results, the world-transcending benefits. And so all of these stages of enlightenment, stages of realization, stages of liberation, come about through the acquisition of merits, the accumulation of merits. It's sometimes said that for any kind of supramundane realization, one needs two collections, two types of accumulations. One of these is the accumulation of merit, the other is the accumulation of wisdom or understanding. And so if one just has the merits without the wisdom or understanding, then one can just gain the mundane benefits of the merits. If one has a lot of understanding and wisdom, but doesn't have merits, I think one could still perhaps reach some supramundane realization, but one will be in difficult circumstances in the course of one's life. But if one has both wisdom, the accumulation of wisdom, and the accumulation of merits, then one can achieve world-transcending realizations and also have good circumstances, good conditions for one's life. Okay, so then the question comes up, what is it that brings this accumulation of merit? What are the bases of meritorious deeds? From one angle, we could simply explain as following the 10 courses of wholesome conduct that I explained last week. But the Buddhist texts deal with this question from a somewhat different angle, a more positive angle. And they answer that there are 3 bases of meritorious deeds, 3 types of actions that one can perform that generate merit. Okay, so the bases for meritorious deeds, these are called the Punya Kiriyavatu, which means the base, literally the base for doing merit. And these 3 are giving, generosity, then virtue or moral discipline, the sila, and the third is bhavana, which means development of mind. Often it's translated meditation. So bhavana has somewhat wider significance than the English word meditation. Okay, what lies at the root of all meritorious deeds is really the mind itself. So it's not simply physical action, but it is the mind, the wholesome mind that accompanies these meritorious deeds. Because karma basically consists in volition, intention. But yet this intention can express itself in various ways. And so these 3 types of actions These are the three ways in which wholesome intention manifests itself in certain types of actions. Okay, we find that our texts give somewhat detailed treatment to these types of meritorious action. We come to the first of these texts on page 166. And here the Buddha is speaking to the monks, and he says that they should not be afraid of meritorious deeds. And I think he might have said this, the Buddha might have said this, because some people have the impression that deeds of merit are only for people who are engaged in worldly life, but that when one renounces the world, when one becomes a monastic person, that one is supposed to give up deeds of merit and just focus on the path to liberation. But in actual Buddhist practice, this is not the case. That the Buddha, here he's encouraging the monks to do meritorious deeds. And then the Buddha explains that meritorious deeds, or punya, is an expression denoting happiness, what is desirable, wished for, dear, and agreeable. And then the Buddha explains that he himself knows from direct experience that deeds of merit can produce desirable results. And then he explains, this is now referring to an earlier life. He says that in some earlier life, I had cultivated for 7 years a mind of loving kindness. That means that the Buddha practiced metta bhavana, the meditation on loving kindness. He must have done it consistently for 7 years. We read in the Jataka stories that in many of his past lives, the Bodhisattva, the being who was aspiring for Buddhahood, whenever he would have the opportunity, he would leave the household life, even when there wasn't a Buddha living in the world, but still he would become an ascetic, a wandering ascetic, somewhat like the rishis, the ancient Indian rishis. And so he would shave off his head or let the hair grow long and wear the ochre robes of an ascetic and go to live in the forest or in the mountains to practice meditation. And so he explains how on one occasion or in one life he practiced the meditation on loving kindness for 7 years. He must have been able to develop all of the jhanas based on loving kindness. And then as a result of that, he says, for 7 aeons of expansion, of contraction and expansion, I did not return to this world. That is, during this period of time, the whole universe went through 7 big bangs and then 7 big crunches all coming together. One big bang, up to the time from one big bang to one big crunch. I think, excuse me?
Rib apart and rib. It's called big rib.
Big
Rib.
rib.
Yes. The universe collapses.
When it collapses. Oh, I didn't know this term. R-I-P? Rip. Okay, anyway, the time between world contraction, world expansion would be something like, this is my own estimate, about 35 billion years. If we take the period of expansion of the universe to be 17 billion years, period of contraction to be another 17 billion years, so 34, 35 billion years. Then 7 of these, I don't do multiplication so quickly in my mind. Okay, so during the period of the contraction of the world system, the Buddha was reborn in what is called the plane of the gods of streaming radiance. This is a realm of existence that's not affected by the destruction of the world system. And then when the world would expand again, the Buddha was reborn in the Brahma world, and he took rebirth as Mahabrahma, the great Brahma, who in the ancient Indian belief system is the mundane ruler of the world. And then 36 times he says, I was Sakka, the ruler of the Devas. Sakka is the king of the Devas in the Tavatimsa Deva world. This is one of the lower realms of the gods. And then many hundreds of times he was a wheel-turning monarch. This is a universal monarch, one who rules over what are called the 4 regions of the world. And then many more times he was a local king. And then when he asked himself, of what kind of deed of mine is this the fruit? Then the answer occurred to him, it is the fruit of 3 kinds of deeds of mine. The ripening of 3 kinds of deeds. Deeds of giving, deeds of self-mastery. This would be the mastery of the mind, probably corresponding with meditation. And deeds of refraining. That would be refraining from unwholesome actions. The practice of sila, or morality. And there's this one kind of problem that arises from this idea that meritorious deeds bring beneficial results for oneself in the future. And that is that some people, actually many people, think that this is not a proper motivation for doing good deeds. That one should do good deeds because one could see that they're morally necessary, that they give one a sense of happiness and satisfaction right here and now, and one shouldn't really be concerned with whether they lead to beneficial results in the future. In fact, that this can be a kind of clinging or selfish motivation for doing good deeds. Now, I have to admit that I've struggled with this problem myself, because if I do something good, I don't do it because I want to be rich in the future, or because I want to become powerful. I have no desire to be a king at all. Okay, so what I would say, this is my way of resolving this particular problem, is that one's actual motivation for doing good, wholesome deeds should be the fact that this is what is either morally obligatory in a particular situation, or what is morally commendable. And also because these types of deeds bring immediate benefits to oneself, not in the form of some kind of fruit external to the deed itself, but just doing good helps to purify one's mind, and it brings immediate happiness and joy. But still, one should recognize that these wholesome deeds will bring good results in the future. And while one recognizes this, one should not do the deed merely because it brings results in the future, out of a kind of greedy attachment to the good results of the action. But also, what seems to me to be the case, that it becomes for many people an important motivation to know that they will gain beneficial results in the future. See, there are probably many people who, if they were told this is a good, worthy deed, but they don't have any conception of fruits of the merit of merit, then they wouldn't have a strong motivation for doing these deeds. And so it's a kind of general incentive for many people to do wholesome deeds if they know that unwholesome deeds will bring painful results and wholesome deeds will bring beneficial results, then they will have sufficient motivation for themselves to do wholesome deeds. But I think the ideal way to engage in wholesome action is to do so without any kind of yearning or craving for the beneficial results of those deeds. Okay, now in the next section, the Buddha is going to speak about the three bases of merit. And here he begins simply by enumerating what are the three ways of making merit. They are by giving, by moral discipline, and by the development of meditation. That is, dana, sila, and bhavana. And then he speaks about the results of these meritorious deeds in terms of future rebirth. Okay, so one who practices the making of merit by giving and by moral discipline only to a limited degree, but who does not undertake the making of merit by meditation, such a person, with the breakup of the body after death, will be reborn among humans. A human rebirth is considered always to be a favorable rebirth, even under just about any conditions. It's a desirable rebirth, and it comes about as the fruit of merits. But if one has only a limited accumulation of merit through giving and through morality, then when one is reborn as a human being, it will generally be in unfavorable conditions, in an unfavorable condition. But then, if a person practices the making of merit by giving and by moral discipline to a high degree, but has not undertaken the way of making merit by meditation, with the breakup of the body after death, he may be reborn among humans in a favorable condition. But if he has even a greater accumulation of merit, then he can be reborn in one of the Deva worlds, the Devas of the four great kings, the Tavatimsa Devas, the Yama Devas, the Tusita Devas, the Devas who delight in creating, and the Devas who wield power over others' creations. And then when he is reborn in these realms, then this one with a lot of accumulation of merit will surpass the Devas of that realm in 10 respects. In divine lifespan, that means he has a very long lifespan, divine beauty, divine happiness, divine fame or good reputation, divine power, and then in divine sight, sounds, smells, tastes, and touches. The one thing that sometimes occurs to me in connection with these fruits of merit, I don't know all the details about how karma and rebirth work, the principles of karma and rebirth, but what seems to me to be the case is that very often it is not the favorable conditions, but it is the unfavorable conditions, the difficulties that one meets, the challenges, the obstructions, the problems, the trials and tribulations through which one has to go that promote one's spiritual growth. Because it's when one confronts situations like that one has to develop faculties that are lying dormant within one's mind that might otherwise, if one isn't challenged by difficulties and trials, not be able to develop these faculties so effectively. So people who are reborn under extremely favorable conditions, wealthy, well-established family, sometimes they take these conditions for granted and then they become very complacent and then don't make any effort to cultivate themselves. Whereas somebody who is born under difficult conditions will face challenges which will spur them to a higher development. One example of this in recent Indian history was a man known as Dr. Ambedkar. He was reborn in a family which is called an untouchable family, belonging to the lowest caste, actually the outcasts among the outcasts in Indian society. And yet, when he was a young boy, he was treated with such disdain, contempt by the people in the mainstream society, by the Brahmins and the high caste people. And yet, in his studies, he made every effort to improve himself through education. He did brilliantly in school, so he applied to go to England to study, I think, at Cambridge or Oxford. He received a scholarship, and when he came back, he was such a brilliant master of law that he was requested to write the Indian Constitution, which he did. And then in the 1950s, he wanted to follow another religion, to abandon Hinduism and embrace another religion. And so he studied the different religions, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, and then decided that the religion that seems the most rational, the most cogent for modern times is Buddhism. And so he led millions, maybe several hundred million untouchable people in a great ceremony to relinquish their position as within the Hindu system and to embrace Buddhism. Now, if he had been reborn as a Brahmin because of his good deeds from a past life, he wouldn't have the opportunity to develop in that way. But don't think that for this reason you should engage in unwholesome actions. Still, one should do as much merit as possible. And I think if one has the right accumulation of merit, that will bring you into situations of difficulty, trials and tribulations where you're challenged to develop your higher potential. Okay, another basis for the generation of merit is the particular quality of mind that accompanies acts of faith or confidence. And so in another passage which we've included in this book, the Buddha speaks about the 4 best kinds of confidence. This is confidence or trust that one places in spiritual teachers and spiritual teachings. So he says that first, whatever kinds of living beings there are, And he mentions all the different types of living beings, all the different classes. The Tathagata, that means the Buddha himself. The Arahant, the perfectly enlightened one, is declared the best among them. And those who have confidence in the Buddha have confidence in the best of all living beings. And for those who have confidence in the best, then the result or fruit of that act of confidence is the best. Then in regard to teachings, the Buddha says, to whatever extent there are things, and here the Pali word is dhammas, things that are conditioned, the Noble Eightfold Path is the best among them. And so those who have confidence in the Noble Eightfold Path have confidence in the best, and for them the result is best. Okay, then, to whatever extent there are things, whether conditioned or unconditioned, among all these things, all of these dhammas, the best among them is viraga, which literally means dispassion. But here the Buddha equates viraga, dispassion, with nibbana, nirvana. And so then he says, those who have confidence in the Dhamma have confidence in the best. So the Dhamma, that's the actual refuge for Buddhists, is first the Noble Eightfold Path, and then Nibbana as the unconditioned. And then amongst all of the different spiritual communities or groups, the Buddha says that the Tathagata's Sangha of disciples is declared among them. And so those who have confidence in the Sangha have confidence in the best. And for those who have confidence in the best, the result is best. And what is meant here by the Sangha of the Tathagata's disciples, this is not just the monastic order, or it's not the monastic order as such, but it's rather the persons who have, through the Buddha's teaching, through the practice of the Buddha's teaching, have reached the different levels of enlightenment or realization. These are sometimes called the 4 pairs of persons, or the 8 types of individuals. We will examine that in more detail next semester. Okay, maybe now before I go into the particular types of merit in more detail, I'll ask if there's any general questions. Yes?
Yes, it says the Eightfold Path is the best of conditions.
Yeah.
So that is a process that leads to Nibbana.
Exactly.
Which is also defined as the unconditioned.
Yeah.
I've always thought of that. It seems a little paradoxical to me. Following a path or a process which is conditioned to condition myself
Yeah.
to become unconditioned. And the only way I'll be able to think like that makes sense is to also think of Nibbana as being as an alternate defined as the cessation of passion or dispassion, which you all also just said now.
Mm-hmm.
I struggle with Nibbana quite often. But when I equate this on really fundamental psychological level, such as that, pieces seem to align pretty neatly. Is that doing justice?
Yeah, okay, this is an important point. Okay, now this is the way I would understand Nibbana. It's also the way the Buddhist tradition does. Nibbana is unconditioned, which means it has no beginning in time, no origin, no passing away, no extinction, no cessation. And it's a state which is a timeless state outside the framework of space and time. But Nibbana is sometimes referred to by a number of synonyms which we can relate to psychologically. Like here it's called the crushing of pride, the removal of thirst, the uprooting of attachment, the termination of the round of existence, the destruction of craving, dispassion, cessation, Nibbana. Okay, the way we understand this is that Nibbana is not literally the crushing of pride, the uprooting of attachment in their psychological sense. But Nibbana is unarisen, unchanging, deathless, always present. The path is a conditioned phenomena because all of the path factors are things that we have to originate within ourselves. Right view, right thought, right action, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. All of these things we originate in ourselves through our practice and mental development, moral and mental development. But when all of the path factors reach maturity, then they bring the realization of Nibbana, the kind of direct experience of Nibbana, the unconditioned. And when that realization of the unconditioned becomes complete, then it uproots and destroys attachment, pride, craving, thirst, and all of the other defilements. And so Nibbana comes to be called, in a kind of derivative sense, it's called dispassion, the crushing of pride, the uprooting of attachment, and so on. But Nibbana itself is not the event of pride being crushed, of attachment being uprooted. If that were the case, then Nibbana would be something that occurs in time, whereas Nibbana is supposed to be timeless.
So there very definitely is, to give the term full, adequate treatment, you must include this transcendent component. It's not merely the extinguishment of distorted psychological states of mind, greed, hatred.
Right, expressed very well.
It must include this transcendent
Yeah.
element.
Yeah. And now the problem that you face in asking how can a conditioned phenomenon, like the Noble Eightfold Path, lead to an unconditioned state? I just will try to answer by a simile. It's like there's a city, let us say New York City, and then there's a road that goes to New York City. Now we get in the car, we drive along that road, and we arrive in New York City. But now we cannot say that it is the road that gives rise to New York City. Much less can we say that it's our driving along that road that gives rise to New York City. Of course, New York City is not unconditioned, this is just a simile. But we could say that from the standpoint of my one lifetime, that New York City was there even before I was born. And let us say I'm born out here in Putnam County, I've never been to New York before. Then I take that road on one occasion and I arrive in New York City. So it's the road that leads to the city and my driving that enables me to reach the city. But my driving does not bring New York City into existence. Yes?
I'm not 100% clear in terms Because if you look at a lot of people, by the time they die, some people are actually quite ready to die and to give up everything. So when they do die, I mean, I've known a couple of people in my life that I really think had no craving whatsoever.
Yeah.
But they want to be enlightened, they're good people. So what I'm saying is that when they come back,
Yeah.
do they come back as a result of ignorance? Because from what I can tell, they had no desire to come back, or do they come back because of their past karma?
Okay.
And the second thing is that the book mentions a lot of these states. I mean, what if somebody aspires to not have any state, but just simply go to the unconditioned? Is that possible?
Let's take one question, one question at a time. Okay, in reply to the first question, it's ignorance and craving together that bring about rebirth. In fact, one can't have craving without ignorance. Whenever there's ignorance, there's some craving. So even though these people, because of their advanced age, illness, it might seem that they have no desire for life anymore, but this is simply because of the aging and because they're afflicted by some illness. But the craving itself has not really been eradicated in them. That comes only through very deep insight into the nature of conditioned existence. Okay, one point. The second point.
I mean, second point is here where, on page 1.
Oh, right, okay. Can one aspire for the unconditioned and not for one of these? Definitely one can aspire for the unconditioned. And if one has strong enough insight, already has, in the course of a life, one has developed strong insight, then at the time of death, one could attain realization even in the death process, and then possibly achieve liberation in the death process. So one doesn't have to focus one's mind on being reborn in one of these Deva worlds. And also, many people that I know who are Buddhists and believe fully in the process of rebirth don't want to make any fixed determination to be reborn in one of the Deva worlds, but just take the attitude, let me go wherever my karma will take me. But if one does aspire to be reborn in one of the Deva worlds and one has sufficient accumulation of merits, then one can aspire for that type of rebirth. And if the accumulation of merits is enough, then it will sort of empower you to reach that plane of rebirth.
So in that sense, a previous teacher of mine had said that the universe was neutral. Then actually the universe is not neutral, because it is dependent on our purification for us to get back to the unconditioned. And the unconditioned therefore cannot be neutral.
I don't know what's meant by being neutral.
In the Christian cosmology, God is love.
Yeah.
And so my question to my teacher had been, what is God in the Buddhist terminology? And the answer was neutral.
Neutral.
Neutral. So neither good nor bad, just simply neutral. And then as I had studied through the importance of morality, like the insight is extremely important. And in order to get back to one's original state, one has to purify oneself to get back to that point.
Yeah.
And if that is the case, then from what I understand, the universe, call it God, call it unconditioned, is actually not neutral.
If by neutral you mean morally neutral, then this is definitely not the case. You could say that the unconditioned technically we say that the unconditioned is ethically neutral and that in itself it is not considered wholesome or unwholesome. Wholesome and unwholesome apply to human mental states and human actions. Or not only human, but to the mental states and actions of living beings. They don't apply to the unconditioned, but to reach the unconditioned, one has to develop the wholesome to a very, very high degree, both in actions and in the quality of one's mind. It's not neutral in the sense that you try to avoid both wholesome and unwholesome, but rather it comes by developing the wholesome to a very high degree of potency, and then that is what enables the attainment or realization of the unconditioned. Any further short questions? Easy ones.
Okay, I have a short question.
Okay.
Is confidence in Eightfold, Noble Eightfold Path the same as confidence in Sila?
Confidence in
Sila.
Sila. Sila is part of the Noble Eightfold Path, but it's not the whole thing.
Because normally you would say the four confidence.
Oh, I see. The four types of... those are called the four factors of stream entry. What's said is that the stream enterer has unshakable confidence in the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, and possesses those virtues which are loved by the noble ones, unbroken, untorn, unspotted, conducive, praised by the wise, conducive to concentration. But that is not a confidence. There are three objects of confidence: Buddha, Dhamma, and Aryan Sangha. And then the fourth factor of stream entry is observing the silas unbroken. But here these are objects of confidence. And so confidence in the Noble Eightfold Path is part of confidence in the Dhamma. So when one has confidence in the Dhamma, what it really means is not so much confidence simply in the verbal teaching of the Buddha, but confidence in the path and confidence in the ultimate goal, Nibbana. Okay, so now we'll come to what's called the bases of meritorious deed. These are treated in a variety of texts, generally short texts. Here we have on page 169, the Buddha teaching giving or generosity. And he begins with a very, very powerful statement that if people knew as I know the result of giving and sharing, they would not eat without having given, nor would they allow the stain of niggardliness or miserliness to obsess them and take root in their minds. Then he says, even if they had their last morsel of food, their last mouthful, they would not eat without having shared it, if there was someone to share it with. But then he says, since people do not know as I know the result of giving and sharing, they eat without having given, and the stain of niggardliness obsesses them and takes root in their minds. So a statement like this provides a strong incentive for generosity. Okay, then in the second selection, the Buddha will explain 8 reasons for giving, or 8 motivations that people have for giving. Okay, the first 3 show that giving can be based to some extent even on unwholesome roots of the mind. People might give out of affection, like one has a personal affection for a close relative or friend, and so one gives to them. And sometimes people give in an angry mood. Maybe if one has something that one doesn't like and one is angry, and will just give it to the other person. Say, here, you take this. Or sometimes if people see a poor person or a beggar, they might feel contempt and anger towards them for begging, but still they'll give, even though they have this anger and contempt in their mind. And sometimes they give out of stupidity, out of dullness of mind. I can't think of a good example of this.
Blind faith, superstition.
Maybe so, yeah. Maybe that's, maybe thinking that they'll be lucky if they give. Sometimes they might think, on the 9th of the month, that's supposed to be my lucky day. If I give something on that day, that's what the astrologist, my horoscope says, you should give on the 9th. So I'll give on that day. But they give out of fear. Yeah, this is another motivation. Somebody threatens them and says, if you don't give, I'm going to harm you. Okay, so these are normally unwholesome motivations, but still, if one gives, even though it's inspired by such an unwholesome motivation, still the giving will be in itself an act of merit. Because at the time one relinquishes the gift, even if it's just for a few moments, a few thought moments, there is the intention of giving, of relinquishing some belonging. And so that moment in which one gives will be the occasion for wholesome states of mind to be present. Okay, another motivation is because this is a family tradition. So my grandparents and parents have always supported this charitable organization, and so now I should follow this old family tradition. Another motivation is to gain the merits that will lead to a good rebirth. So one thinks, by giving this gift, I will be reborn in a good state, a happy world, a heavenly world after death. And then one gives with the thought, when giving this gift, my heart will be glad and happiness and joy will arise in me. And then the 8th reason is one gives because it ennobles and adorns the mind. And you can see here that there seems to be, we might call this an ascending level of excellence in the motivations for giving. So at the bottom, one has giving with one of these 4 unwholesome motivations. Then giving just because it's part of a family tradition is the 5th. Then the 6th, giving with the desire for some good fortune in future lives. But that is not yet the highest motivation. But the 2 motivations that come after that are giving because it makes one happy and joyful, and then giving because it ennobles and adorns the mind. But one motivation, I have to say, that I find is very important in giving, and that I don't see listed here, and that is that it will alleviate the suffering of the person who receives the gift, or that it will bring some concrete benefits to the person who receives the gift. But I think we also have to take that into account. Okay, and then we'll come to passage number 3. This is called the gift of food. This is like one of the basic texts on which monks in the Theravada tradition will give the sermon after an alms offering, after when people often invite the Sangha group of monks, the Theravada countries, to come to their home, then they'll offer them a meal and additional requisites. And then after the meal, the monk will preach a sermon to the lay people. And often the sermon will be based on a text like this. Okay, so here a laywoman named Supavasa has offered the Buddha the gift of a meal. And then after the meal, the Buddha preaches a sermon, or gives her a discourse, in which he says that by giving food, one gives 4 things to the recipients. What are these 4 things? Long life, because it's the food that extends the lifespan. One gives beauty, because if one doesn't eat, then the features, one's body becomes thin, and one's features become shriveled. But when one has sufficient food, then one's features become pleasing. Then one has happiness, and one gains strength, good health. Some other texts also mention a 5th benefit. This is called patibana, which we could say means intelligence or mental acuity. Because if one is hungry, starving, then the mind can't work very efficiently. One is always thinking about food. But when one has sufficient food, but not too much so that one becomes dull and drowsy, but enough food to keep one in good health, then the mind can function effectively. Okay, so one gives these 4 things, long life, beauty, happiness, and strength, and then as a result of giving the food, one gains. Is there a musician in the room? One gains 4 benefits. That one gains the meritorious karma of giving the food will conduce to long life. It will conduce to beauty. It will conduce to happiness. And it conduces to strength and good health. Okay, then the next passage explains 5 ways in which a superior person, this is what is called sappurisa, a good person, a superior person, gives a gift. And here I think the Buddha is explaining particularly a gift that's offered to the Buddha himself, to the Sangha, or to wandering ascetics who are leading a religious life, a spiritual life. Because in India during the Buddha's time, there was a large companies of ascetics, wanderers, who would leave the household life in order to lead a life of meditation, spiritual development. And when they leave the household life, then they don't cultivate their own food. They don't carry money to purchase food from the shops. But the Indian tradition, which still continues today, is that ascetics, wanderers, subsist with an alms bowl. And when they need food, then they go into the village or into the town or amongst the houses, walking for alms, collecting the alms into their alms bowl. They receive as much as they need, then take it back to their hermitage or monastery and then eat. And so it becomes then the responsibility of the lay community of people in the world to support the wandering ascetics, whether they're Buddhist or non-Buddhist. And by doing this, the lay people gain merit by making the offerings, and often the sort of general principle is that the wanderer should recite some blessing for the lay people, or sometimes give them a little discourse, some piece of spiritual advice. And so this brings a concrete benefit to the layperson right here and now. Okay, so when the superior person gives a gift, he gives a gift out of faith. That is, he has faith in the law of cause and effect, the law of karma. So maybe his motivation is not just to get beneficial results for himself, but he does know that there is this law of cause and effect, of moral causation. And so he gives in the knowledge or out of faith in this law of moral causation. He gives respectfully. He gives a gift at the right time. So he chooses the right time for giving the gift. Okay, he gives a gift with a generous heart. That is, he establishes within his mind the feeling of generosity, the motivation of generosity. And he gives a gift without denigration. That is, without denigrating the receiver. Sometimes people might give a gift and then they speak ill of the recipient. Why is that beggar coming around to our house? Even though this might be the Buddha himself or highly accomplished meditators. Okay, and then the rest of the text explains some of the benefits that come from giving with these five qualities. Other texts explain that when one is giving, one should arouse joy in the mind on 3 occasions. First, when one is preparing the gift, one should arouse joy thinking, I have this opportunity to practice generosity. Then, while one is making the gift, one arouses joy thinking, now I am able to practice generosity. Then after one is given the gift, one doesn't look back on the gift with regrets, with remorse, but one looks back at the act of giving again with joy in one's mind, thinking, I had this precious opportunity to practice generosity. Okay, the next text explains the relationship between the Buddhist monastics and the Buddhist lay community. The Buddha explains that first, that Brahmins and householders are very helpful to you. It's interesting that the text includes Brahmins in here. But it seems that many Brahmins supported the Buddha and the Buddha Sangha. So the Buddha says, Brahmins and householders are very helpful to you. They provide you with the requisites of robes, alms food, lodgings, and medicines in time of sickness. These are known as the 4 requisites of the monastic life, the 4 things that one basically needs, especially in the Buddha's time when the monks lived very simply. Just robes to cover the body, alms food to sustain them through the day. Usually they would just go on alms round once a day in the morning and collect all the food they need for the day, taking 1 meal or 2 meals a day. Then lodging, which would usually often be just a simple hut or a monastery. And then medicines to use in time of sickness. So the lay community provides the monastics with these 4 requisites. And then the Buddha says, you monks are very helpful to Brahmins and householders, since you teach them the Dhamma that's good in the beginning, middle, and end, with the correct meaning and wording, and you proclaim the spiritual life, the brahmacharya, in its fulfillment and complete purity. And then the Buddha says that the spiritual life is lived with mutual support for the purpose of crossing the flood of greed, hatred, and delusion, or the flood of birth and death, and making a complete end of suffering. Okay, then the 6th text on giving explains how rebirth takes place as a result of giving. And here the Buddha is taking the case of somebody who hopes for a specific reward, a specific type of rebirth as a result of giving. So somebody makes a gift to an ascetic or a Brahmin. He mentions a variety of things that can be given. And then he notices noble or wealthy nobles, Brahmins or householders enjoying themselves, provided and furnished with the 5 objects of sense pleasure. That's delightful form, sound, smells, tastes, and tactile objects. And then he thinks, may I be reborn amongst this group. Then he sets his mind on that thought. He keeps to it firmly and he increases it, he fosters it. And so one is developing a strong intention to be reborn in a certain realm. And then the Buddha says that this thought of his aims at what is low, because it's a lower type of rebirth in the whole scale of existence. And if not developed higher, it will lead him to just such a rebirth. And with the breakup after death, he will be reborn among affluent nobles, Brahmins, or householders. But then the Buddha adds an important sentence. He says, this I declare only for those who are morally pure, not for those who are immoral, who break the precepts. Because it is due to his purity that the heart's desire of a morally pure person succeeds. So in other words, if one practices giving and wants to be reborn in a particular realm through that act of giving, one also has to be observing the principles of moral purity. If one is generous but doesn't observe the principles of moral purity, doesn't follow the precepts, then that act of generosity, it's still wholesome karma, but it doesn't have that sufficient strength to lead to rebirth in the particular realm that one aspires to be reborn. Then the same thing is stated with regard to the other realms of rebirth in the lower Deva worlds. Again, one needs that moral purity. Then the Buddha says this, we come to the last full paragraph in this passage. A person hears of the long life, beauty, and great happiness of the Devas and Brahma's company. This is the Devas in the Brahma world. And he wishes to be reborn among them. Okay, all of the same requirements are stated. And then the Buddha says, after his death, when his body breaks up, he will be reborn among the Devas of Brahma's company. Then he says, this I declare happens only for the morally pure, not for the immoral person, and only for one who is free of lust, not for one who is lustful. Okay, this is a technical expression. What's meant here by being without lust or free of lust is that one has attained the meditative state of samadhi called one of the jhanas, at least the first jhana. Because it's in the first jhana that one completely overcomes sensual desire temporarily. It's not complete release from sensual desire. It's a temporary release. But if one develops that strength of concentration, then together with the moral purity and the aspiration to be reborn in the Brahma world, then one can be reborn there. In the Buddha's time, there were many who aspired for rebirth in the Brahma world because the Brahmins believed that the Brahma world was the highest realm. They believed that this was liberation, to be reborn in the Brahma world. And so many of the Brahmins would go into seclusion and practice meditation and reach the jhanas. And then through that meditation they can be reborn in the Brahma world. But the Buddha teaches that the Brahma world is only a temporary stopping place. It's not permanent liberation. Okay, now I'll ask whether there's any questions on the text concerned with giving that I've just gone through. Yes.
As Buddha defined the morally pure, is it just 5 precepts or more?
I would think that this is the 5 precepts. But in the case of taking rebirth in the Brahma world, I'd say that that was probably necessary as brahmacharya, which means observing celibacy. Okay, so any questions? 1, 2, 3. Okay.
Is the issue with giving out of affection, is that because of foster attachment? Is that the...
Well, the giving itself is a wholesome act.
I understand.
Yeah, it's an act which shows some giving up of temporary giving up of attachment. But one gives to a person to whom one has personal affection. So it's not such a challenging act of generosity. Because even just through natural instinct, one wants to give to those for whom one has affection.
Which is not some sort of marital.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, then we go on to the second base for merit. This is called sila, moral discipline. And the most common code of moral discipline that the Buddha teaches is the code of the 5 precepts: to abstain from giving, to abstain from the destruction of life, to abstain from taking what is not given, to abstain from sexual misconduct, to abstain from false speech, and to abstain from the use of intoxicants. Okay, here, the first text I have, the Buddha speaks about 8 streams of merit, streams of the wholesome, which he calls nourishments of happiness, things that are heavenly, ripen in happiness, and lead to heaven, and lead to everything else that's wished for, loved, agreeable to one's well-being and happiness. Okay, the first 3 are 3 refuges. But then comes the 5 precepts. And what's interesting is that the Buddha here calls them 5 gifts. It seems almost as if he's including morality under the broader heading of giving. And he'll explain why. Okay, he calls them 5 gifts that are pristine, of long-standing, traditional, ancient, and unadulterated. So these 5 precepts, I think, were not invented by the Buddha himself, but they were probably part of the general Indian culture, religious culture at the time of the Buddha. Except I believe that the Brahmins, because of their text, the Vedas, which require some animal sacrifice, didn't completely adhere to the principle of non-destruction of life. But these might have been the principles of morality that existed outside Brahmanism in the older culture of India, the pre-Brahmanic culture of India. Okay, anyway, the Buddha says here, he says, the noble disciple gives up the destruction of life and abstains from it. And now he's going to explain how this is an act of giving. By abstaining from the destruction of life, the noble disciple gives to immeasurable beings, countless beings, freedom from fear, freedom from hostility, freedom from oppression. And this is something that always strikes me about this, how wonderful these 5 precepts are. If one just, not to speak of 5 precepts, just observes this one precept, to abstain from killing, then this means that all other living beings, whether human beings, animals, insects, have no reason to be afraid of you because you're observing this precept. Okay, then by giving to immeasurable beings freedom from fear and so on, then one himself will enjoy immeasurable freedom from fear, hostility, and oppression. I don't know if this is always the case in actual life, since those who can be harmless can be subject to harm and oppression by others. Like in Burma a few months ago when the monks were marching in the spirit of non-violence, harmlessness, loving kindness. Still, when the government gave the orders to the army, then they shot at the monks and other demonstrators and killed them quite ruthlessly. But still, I would say that the act of abstaining from killing creates a karma which conduces, maybe not in this life, but in future lives. It acts as a kind of protection around one to safeguard one's life and prevents an early death. Okay, then the noble disciple gives up taking what is not given and abstains from it, gives up sexual misconduct and abstains from it, gives up false speech, gives up wine, liquors, and intoxicants, and abstains from them. And in each case, one, by observing these precepts, one gives to beings, to countless beings, freedom from fear. Fear of their goods being stolen, freedom from fear of any kind of sexual transgression against them, freedom from fear of being deceived with falsehoods in the case of speech. And then, because one abstains from intoxicants, then one protects beings from the type of reckless and careless actions which people commit when they become intoxicated. Okay, so this is the basic moral code that the Buddha teaches for people in everyday lives, in their everyday lives. That is the 5 precepts. But then the Buddha also teaches a more stringent code of ethical discipline that people can observe on special days. These are called, special days are called the Uposatha days. The Uposatha was an ancient observance observed by the Brahmins even before the time of Buddhism, before the time of the Buddha. But the Buddha incorporated this observance into his own training and gave special regulations for lay people to observe on the Uposatha. And the foundation for the Uposatha observance is undertaking 8 precepts. These are the basic code of 5 precepts, except that the 3rd precept is changed from abandoning sexual misconduct to abandoning any kind of sexual activity and instead observing celibacy, brahmacharya. And so one observes that principle at least for this full day and night, the day and night of the Uposatha. Okay, then on the Uposatha, one takes on 3 additional precepts, which are starting to become identical with the precepts that a monk observes when becomes ordained as a novice. First, one refrains from eating at night, or actually from eating outside the prescribed time. The prescribed time is from dawn until midday. Then from midday until the next dawn, one does not eat any solid or solid foods, but just drinks liquid. One can drink liquid, except for nourishing liquids like milk. Okay, then one abstains from dancing, singing, instrumental music, and what's called unsuitable shows, and from adorning oneself with wearing garlands, jewelry, applying perfumes and scents, beauty lotions. And then one abstains from the use of high and luxurious beds and seats, and one makes use of low resting places, either a low bed or a straw mat. Okay, these additional precepts, celibacy, not taking food after midday, and then abstaining from dancing, singing, and so on, abstaining from the use of high and luxurious beds, these really have nothing to do with morality in the strict sense, but rather they signify a change in the nature of the moral discipline, but in the nature of the discipline being undertaken by the disciple. It's now passing over from being a purely moral discipline which we have in the 5 precepts, it's now becoming a type of ascetic discipline, a discipline which involves restraint from the indulgence in pleasures of the senses. One is now moving in the direction of renunciation, even though one is observing it just for one day and one night, but for that period one is living effectively the life of a monastic person. And this becomes, in Buddhist countries, a major observance. The Uposatha comes on the regular Uposatha observance on the full moon and the dark moon. And then people will sometimes observe the Uposatha the day before and the day after, as well as the full moon and dark moon days. And so the night before the Uposatha, one sees, and this is in Sri Lanka, which I'm most familiar with, many lay people will go to the monastery, and then they will stay there overnight. They take the 8 precepts, and then through the next day there will be sessions and meditation, devotional practices, sermons, discourses given by Buddhist monks. And then, after the Uposatha is finished, then they give up the 8 precepts, and again they take the 5 precepts. And then the Buddha explains the benefits of this Uposatha observance. He says, suppose somebody were to become a king of these 16 great countries. These were the 16 states during the Buddha's time. He says, this would not be worth a 16th part of the Uposatha observance complete in those 8 factors. And why is that? Because human kingship is poor compared to divine happiness. That is, observing the Uposatha precepts creates the wholesome meritorious karma leading to a rebirth in the heavenly realms. And then the Buddha explains the lifespan of the beings in the different heavenly realms. Okay, I'll just move quickly now to the 3rd base of merit. The 3rd base of merit is, we call it in Pali, bhavana, which means, literally it means development or cultivation. The development or cultivation of the mind. And this is what is done through the practice of meditation. And then the Buddha explains, under this category we could bring the whole practice of Buddhist meditation. But I will treat the practice of Buddhist meditation more completely when we come to the world-transcending Dharma. So as a factor of the path to a fortunate rebirth, the Buddha gives special emphasis to the type of meditation which is called the 4 divine abodes. That is, boundless loving kindness, compassion, altruistic joy, and equanimity, or equality towards others. And the base or starting point of the 4 divine abodes is the meditation on loving kindness. So the Buddha says, whatever grounds there are for making merit productive of a future rebirth, that is, any amongst all of the mundane bases for generating merit, the most powerful, he says, is the liberation of mind by loving kindness. This means using loving kindness as a vehicle of meditation to the point where the mind becomes purified of the hindrances and defilements and is able to delve or reach into the jhanas based on loving kindness. So the Buddha says the liberation by loving kindness surpasses all of the others and shines forth bright and brilliant. And then he compares loving kindness to the others as like the moon, the light of the moon compared to all of the other stars. Or it's like the sun on a clear day when the rainy season is, when the rains are over and the sky becomes very clear, then the sun becomes bright and brilliant. That is like the mind of loving kindness. Or it's like at the moment of dawn when one sees the morning star. Now we know that's Venus. We see Venus or the morning star shining forth bright and brilliant. And so this is like the liberation of mind by loving kindness. And then the next passage explains how these 4 divine abodes are the path to the Brahma world. Some Brahmin, young Brahmin, comes to the Buddha and asks him whether he knows the path to the Brahma world. And the Buddha says that he knows this path just as a man who's born and who's raised in a particular village knows the path that leads to that village. So he knows the path to the Brahma world. And then he explains this as the 4 divine abodes, the meditations on loving kindness, compassion, altruistic joy, and equanimity. And then in the 3rd passage that we have under this heading, the Buddha explains very concretely the relative merits of the different types of actions. So first he begins with the practice of giving or generosity. And he takes the case of even somebody who gives an alms offering to different types of beings, ending with the community of monks headed by the Buddha, and then he builds a monastery and gives it to the Sangha of the 4 quarters. That would be very meritorious, but the Buddha says it would be even more meritorious, more fruitful, if with a mind of trust and confidence one would go for refuge to the 3 jewels, the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, and one undertakes the 5 precepts. But then, as meritorious as this might be, he says it would be even more fruitful if one were to develop a mind of loving kindness, even for the time it takes to pull a cow's udder. Seems the Buddha, even though he grew up in a palace, but he must have been familiar with the process of milking a cow. So I think to pull the cow's udder just takes a few seconds. So if one can develop the mind of loving kindness, even just for a few seconds, but this is probably loving kindness raised to the level of jhana, then it's more fruitful than if one were to feed, to make a meal offering to the whole Sangha with the Buddha at the head, and then build a monastery for the Sangha. But then the Buddha says, as great as all this might be, it would be even more fruitful if one would develop the perception of impermanence It's the insight into impermanence just for the time it takes to snap one's fingers. This is because the perception of impermanence, the insight into permanence, is what can lead to the attainment of the world-transcending path, the path to liberation. Okay, now I'll ask whether there's any questions on any of the texts that we covered dealing with either moral discipline or meditation. Yes?
I have a quick question. So where the noble disciple picks up the discussion of life, does the word noble mean enlightened?
Okay, this is a good question. The question is whether what is called here the noble disciple means one who's reached one of the stages of enlightenment. The way I understand it, that's not the case. What this means is simply a disciple of the noble ones. So it means somebody who is truly and sincerely gone to the three refuges.
In addition to being the abode of the Brahma world, or divine abode, would they also be characteristics of the state of Nibbana, in addition to the extinguishment of craving? Would Nibbana be characterized by these four characteristics?
Nibbana itself is not distinguished by these four characteristics, because Nibbana is an unconditioned state, and these are states of mind that are developed through deliberate activity. But we could say that one who has attained Nibbana will often dwell in these states of mind, the four divine abodes. But one who's attained Nibbana, of course, would not be cultivating these as vehicles for attaining rebirth in the Brahma world.
To some degree, these can be used interchangeably with Nibbana, or not. And the Eightfold Path leads to Nibbana.
Right.
And Nibbana is characterized, or not defined by these four abodes. Is that correct?
I wouldn't say that Nibbana is characterized by the four abodes. Because Nibbana is a state which is unconditioned, transcendent, unborn, unchanging, deathless. But one who has practiced the way to Nibbana and completed it will have these four qualities and will practice these four divine abode meditations. And I should also state that these four divine abode meditations, on the one hand, they constitute part of the way or path to rebirth in the Brahma world. And so if one develops them without wisdom, then, but without a high degree of wisdom, then the state of mind that's developed through that meditation will be such that it will carry one to rebirth in the Brahma world. But one can use those four divine abode meditations as a basis for developing insight or wisdom. So when one has developed one of the four divine abode meditations, then one can use one's insight to see how this divine abode meditation is a state which has been produced through deliberation, through intention, that it's a conditioned state, and that all of its factors, all of its components are impermanent. And because they're impermanent, then they're not qualified to be taken as self or as the belongings of a self. And so in this way one is gaining insight into conditionality, into impermanence, and into the selfless nature of these states. And that will lead then to the insight or wisdom that will bring enlightenment. Okay, you're on.
This is the
development of the four divine abode concentration a necessary condition for the supramundane practice?
No, it's not a necessary condition. There are many, many different ways to reaching supramundane attainments. And often we read about somebody who, let's say in this life, has never knew about Buddhism before, has never practiced meditation before, and they just happen to encounter the Buddha, and the Buddha gives a discourse. Then just by listening to that discourse, they can reach one or another of the stages of realization.
But it could be in their past life they have developed.
That is so. It could be that in their past life they've developed it.
I guess
Development.
the question is, what is the necessary condition? Just we've come to this part, and I think the next chapter, that's what we're going to talk about.
Yeah.
Supramundane practice.
Yeah.
I want to know what is the necessary condition.
For reaching the supramundane, the necessary conditions would be sila, moral discipline, samadhi, concentration, which can come up very, very quickly. This is in the case where somebody is listening to the discourse. As he's listening, he's focusing the mind on the discourse. And probably because of practice in previous lives, while listening, the mind becomes freed from the five hindrances and comes into a state that we call access concentration. It's a samadhi-like state, but not full absorption. And then the most decisive factor is panya, or wisdom, insight into conditionality, the three characteristics.
To what degree does this insight need to be? This evidently is still a mundane state of panya.
Technically, panya is called mundane in that its objects are mundane phenomena, that is, the five aggregates. But when the insight, let us say it's the vipassana panya, insight wisdom, that's still mundane because it's contemplating the five aggregates as impermanent, suffering, non-self, conditioned phenomena. But when the wisdom becomes sharp enough to break through to the unconditioned, then the wisdom becomes world-transcending, supramundane. So the wisdom that realizes any of the four paths leading to the four fruits is supramundane, world-transcending wisdom.
That's next chapter.
Yeah, we come to that next semester. Yes?
I have a question about meditation. Is meditation you can always study, you meditate, or you could just, all you do is just skip to all day, do nothing. We have some other things to do, and how do we do it, meditate our mind and stuff? You know, besides this.
Maybe repeat the question. I didn't quite catch it.
I feel like meditate, right?
Yeah.
Meditation, sometimes we will have to sit and meditate.
Yeah.
But we have another daily stuff to do.
Yeah.
Can't just sit and meditate, and how do we, do the meditation besides just meditate all night?
Okay, one does the meditation, one has several periods per day that one devotes to meditation. If one is living a household life, one has many other things that one has to do. But one reserves certain periods per day, usually in the morning, in the evening, when you have some free time, then you devote those periods to the practice of meditation. Then if you have opportunity, if you have some extended free time, like a vacation, then you can go on a meditation retreat. And during the meditation retreat, then you'll be practicing meditation from the time you wake up to the time you go to sleep all day. Does that answer the question?
Sometimes I think that, if I sit and meditate, and after meditate, I do some other or something like forget everything?
The first, you shouldn't be worried that when you're out of the meditative state, the mind can't be as calm and collected as it is in the meditative state. But if you go about your daily activities, maintaining mindfulness in the course of the day, that will help to keep the mind in a state that's favorable to meditation. So instead of just letting the mind flow and get distracted and carried away by emotions, wandering thoughts, one should do all one's activities trying to be mindful and have clear comprehension of what one is doing as one is doing it. And then when one goes back to sitting in meditation, then the mind will go into the meditative state more easily than if one has to struggle with all of the disturbances and distractions that arise in the course of the day.
Sometimes we find, simply we find that mad or mad. If the kid doesn't listen and I get mad, I try not to be mad, but I can't help myself when I get mad. But I don't know how to not be mad. I just burst.
But this is what you have to train yourself to do, not to let the mind get carried away with anger. But sometimes when you're dealing with young children, you have to be firm, even stern with them, strict with them, so that they will behave properly. But don't let the mind become angry. I think if you reflect on the nature of children, that is the nature of children, just to be playful and to do what they want to do. And then you consider that this is my sacred responsibility, is to train them and bring them up properly. And so when you reflect in that way, then you won't become angry. Maybe somebody else has more experience than I do bringing up children. Somebody can give some advice.
I might have more experience, but I don't think I have any advice.
I think that staying in the present and observing what one's thinking, getting in that habit, you can catch yourself before you let go.
Yeah, if you develop a mind of loving kindness towards the children, or first you develop a general mind of loving kindness, then naturally you'll have a mind of loving kindness towards the children, wishing for their welfare and happiness. And when they're doing things that are annoying you, then you think, I want my children to be well and happy, I want them to be well and happy. And just bring that thought into the mind, even just for 15 seconds, 30 seconds, before turning to the children and trying to discipline them. Then you'll do it with a mind of loving kindness rather than with anger.
Somebody's like this, now that I go meditate, I just can't sit still and not think about it.
Yeah, but that's exactly when you should do the meditation. Even though the mind becomes angry and disturbed and it's bubbling still with the angry thoughts, do the sitting anyway. Even though it seems that you're wasting your time, that you can't concentrate. But what you're doing is bringing the anger into the forefront of the mind. And so you're getting to see directly how anger is a disturbance of the mind. And then as you're sitting through the anger, so it might not seem to be the case, but you're actually building up a certain inner foundation of tranquility in the midst of annoying situations. And sometimes, if you can't focus on any other object, just sit there and focus on your thoughts. Just let the thoughts arise, observe them. Then when they pass, let them pass. And as you go on just watching the mind, you'll find that each angry thought itself loses some of its power till the mind gradually loses that force, explosive force of anger, and settles down and becomes quiet. Then you can bring the mind back to the regular object of meditation. And then that will help you also in daily life when you meet situations that provoke anger. Don't expect that the anger is not going to arise. It will arise. But since you've learned how to observe anger, you just observe the anger for a few moments, then let it settle down. Then when it settles down, then you can act effectively. Okay, if there's any questions, I'll take one more question. Okay, no more questions? Okay, so now this is the end of the fall semester. Then we will have the spring semester will begin, I guess, the first Saturday in April. And because of classes that we missed, I wasn't able to do 2 topics that I had at the end of the fall semester. Those were to be 2 classes on changing one's perspective on the world. So we will take those at the very beginning of the spring semester. So we'll start with the chapter on changing one's perspective on the world, deepening one's perspective on the world. That's chapter 6. Chapter 6, and then go from here into the next chapter on the path to liberation. Okay, we end with the sharing of the merits. This is one important point that I should have stated. That when one does meritorious deeds in Buddhism, one doesn't just cling to the merits as possessions of oneself, but usually every day one does a sharing of the merits, with your mind inviting other beings to rejoice in the merits, and in doing so then they are able to participate in the meritorious deeds. This is somewhat like using one candle, you have a candle, and this candle is burning, and other people have candles that are not yet lit, and so you ask them, invite them to light their candles from your candle. Okay, so now we're going to share the merits with the devas, that's the deities, the nagas, the dragon spirits, the bhutas, the harmful spirits, and all other beings, asking them to protect the Dharma, the Buddha's teachings, to protect the world, to protect ourselves and others. Akasata chabhumata deva naga mahitika punyantam anumoditva chirang rakantu sasanam. Akasata chabhumata deva naga mahitika punyantam anumoditva chirang rakantu desanam. Akasata chabhumata deva naga mahitika punyantam anumoditva chirang rakantu mam param. Etavata cha amhehi sampadam punya sampadam sabbe deva anumodamtu sabba sampati siddhya. Etavata cha amhehi sampadam punya sampadam sabbe bhuta anumodamtu Sabba sampati siddhya etavatacha amhehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe sata anumodantu sabba sampati siddhya Bhavagupadaya avici hetato etantare satakayupapanna rupya rupicha asanya sanyino dukha pamuchantu pusantu mi buddhim.